when Jack Morrison bought an abandoned forest hut deep in the woods. He thought he was just restoring a forgotten cabin. But inside that abandoned forest hut, sitting quietly in the corner, was a rusty refrigerator that felt strangely out of place. What Jack discovered hidden inside that rusty refrigerator would lead him to a nearly century-old secret involving ransom money, a mysterious map, and people who still wanted the truth buried. Subscribe for more powerful stories, and tell us in the comments which city you're watching from. The forest was the kind of place where time didn't move the same way it did in town. Out there, mornings arrived slowly. Fog clung to the ground like a thin blanket, and the tall pines stood so still that even the wind seemed careful not to disturb them. It was quiet in a way that felt older than memory, the kind of quiet that made a man think about the road that had brought him there. That was exactly why Jack Morrison bought the place. At 52, Jack had spent most of his life working with his hands. He repaired roofs after storms, rebuilt decks that had begun to sag, and fixed machines other people had already decided were beyond saving. He never thought of himself as anything special. Just a man who believed that if something had once been useful, it deserved a second chance. After his wife passed a few years earlier, the house in town had grown painfully quiet. Every room seemed to echo with memories he couldn't quite outrun. So, when he heard about a small abandoned cabin deep in the forest, something inside him stirred. Not excitement, something gentler than that. Hope. The cabin sat nearly 2 hours outside the nearest town, surrounded by trees so tall they seemed to guard it from the rest of the world. The roof sagged a little, and the porch boards groaned when Jack stepped on them, but he could already see the shape of what it might become. To most people, it looked forgotten. To Jack, it looked like a place where a man might start over. Jack didn't rush the first day. There was no point in it. Places like this, old places that had been left alone too long, had their own rhythm. If you tried to force things, you missed the small details. And over the years, Jack had learned that the small details were usually where the real story lived. He began with the front windows. Dust had settled so thick on the glass that the sunlight filtered through like pale fog. Jack wiped a clear circle with the sleeve of his flannel shirt and pushed the window open. The hinges protested with a dry groan, but fresh forest air poured inside immediately. It smelled like pine, damp earth, and something older, the kind of smell you only found in places that had been closed up for years. Jack stepped back and took a slow breath. For the first time since his wife had passed, the air around him didn't feel heavy with memory. Out here, the quiet was different, not empty, just still. He moved through the cabin slowly. The place was small, only 2 rooms, and a narrow kitchen tucked against the back wall, but the bones were solid. Whoever had built it had done the job right. The beams were thick oak, darkened with age but still strong. The stone fireplace stood firmly against the far wall. Its mortar cracked but holding. Jack knelt beside it and ran a hand along the rough stones. "You've got a few winters left in you," he murmured. Talking out loud wasn't something he used to do, but after years of living alone, silence had a way of making a man speak just to remind himself he was still there. He spent the next hour carrying broken furniture out to the porch. A chair with one leg snapped clean through. A table that had warped so badly its surface slanted like a hillside. A stack of rotted firewood that crumbled in his hands when he tried to move it. Each piece told a quiet story. Someone had lived here once. Cooked meals, sat beside the fire, waited out long winters while snow piled up against the door. And then, one day, they had simply left. Jack found himself wondering about that more than he expected. Why leave a place like this behind? The forest outside wasn't hostile. It was calm, protective, even. The kind of place people came to when the rest of the world felt too loud. Still, something about the cabin carried a strange silence. Not frightening, just unfinished. By midday, the sun had climbed high enough to send long beams of light through the open windows. Dust floated through the air like tiny drifting stars. Jack leaned against the doorframe and wiped sweat from his forehead. For the first time in a long while, he felt tired in a good way. The kind of tired that came from honest work. He stepped into the small kitchen area, studying the narrow counters and the old sink that had long since stopped running water. A few rusted utensils still hung from hooks on the wall. He reached up and lifted an old iron ladle. Heavy, simple, the kind of thing that had probably served meals here for decades. Jack turned it slowly in his hand, imagining the quiet evenings it had seen. Someone stirring soup over a small fire. The sound of wind brushing the trees outside. Life had once moved slowly here. He set the ladle back in place. Then he noticed something strange. The wooden floor near the back wall bore faint scrape marks, like something heavy had been dragged across it many times. Jack crouched slightly, running his fingers across the worn boards. The marks weren't recent. Years old, maybe more. They led from the far corner of the kitchen toward the center of the room. He followed them with his eyes. At the end of those marks, pushed tightly against the wall as if it had been placed there long ago and forgotten, stood a large metal appliance. Jack hadn't paid much attention to it when he first walked in. In truth, it blended into the room so well it almost disappeared into the background. But now that he was looking closer, something about it didn't sit right. He stood slowly, brushing dust from his hands. The afternoon light coming through the window caught the surface of the old appliance, revealing deep patches of rust and chipped enamel that had turned yellow with age. Jack stepped a little closer, not curious yet, just noticing. Sometimes that was how the strangest discoveries in life began. Not with excitement, not with fear, just with a man pausing and realizing that something ordinary might not be as ordinary as it first appeared. Jack stood there for a moment, studying the old appliance from across the room. At first glance, it looked like the kind of refrigerator people used in the 1940s or 50s, the heavy kind built from thick steel, back when things were made to last longer than the houses they sat in. Its white enamel surface had faded into a dull yellow, and rust had begun creeping along the edges like slow-spreading vines. It didn't belong in a place like this. Most abandoned cabins ended up stripped clean over time. Scrap hunters usually hauled away anything metal years before the walls started rotting. But somehow, this thing had remained exactly where it was. Jack walked closer. His boots echoed softly on the wooden floor as he stopped beside it. Up close, the refrigerator looked even older than he first thought. The handle was thick chrome, pitted and dull from decades of neglect. Small spiderweb cracks ran through the enamel coating. Dust had settled so heavily across the top that it looked almost like gray snow. Jack ran his hand across the surface. The metal was cold. Colder than it should have been in a cabin that hadn't had electricity in years. He frowned slightly. Strange thing to leave behind, he muttered. Most old refrigerators had a manufacturer's badge somewhere on the door, a small metal plate with the brand name stamped proudly into it. This one didn't. Jack leaned closer, brushing away dust with his sleeve. There were faint marks where a badge had once been mounted, but it had been removed. Not fallen off. Removed. That was the first thing that made the back of his neck prickle. The second thing was the weight. Jack wrapped his fingers around the handle and gave the door a gentle pull. It didn't move. He pulled again, harder this time. The door opened slowly with a deep metal groan that echoed through the quiet cabin. The smell that drifted out wasn't what he expected. There was no sour odor of spoiled food, no mold. Just a dry, stale scent, like something that had been sealed away for a very long time. Jack leaned slightly forward and shined the beam of his flashlight inside. The interior looked wrong. There were no shelves, no racks. The inside walls were smooth and thick, as if someone had reinforced them with extra layers of metal. The compartment itself was strangely shallow, leaving far less space than a normal refrigerator should have had. Jack knocked lightly on the inner wall with his knuckle. The sound that came back was dull, dense, not hollow. He leaned back slowly. "All right," he said quietly. Now his curiosity was fully awake. Jack crouched and examined the lower section. The compressor, the part that normally sat behind refrigerators, was missing. Instead, the back panel looked like it had been sealed shut with rough welding lines that someone had tried to paint over. The welds were uneven, messy, definitely not factory work. He circled the appliance slowly. On the rear side, the metal panel showed faint grinding marks, as if tools had been used to open and reseal it at some point long ago. Jack scratched his chin thoughtfully. He had spent 30 years fixing broken machinery. When you worked with tools long enough, you developed a certain instinct about things. And right now, his instincts were telling him this refrigerator wasn't built to keep food cold. It was built to hide something. He stood there for several seconds, staring at the back panel. Part of him considered leaving it alone. Old places carried old stories. Not every one of them needed to be uncovered. But then again, if there was one thing Jack had learned over the years, it was this. If someone went to that much trouble to hide something, it usually meant it was important. Jack walked to his truck outside and returned a moment later, carrying a small red toolbox. Inside were the same tools he used for every repair job: a screwdriver, a pry bar, a small hammer, and a flashlight stronger than the one on his phone. He set the box down beside the refrigerator. The cabin was so quiet now he could hear the wind brushing through the tall pines outside. Jack removed the screws along the edge of the rear panel one by one. Some came out easily. Others resisted, their threads frozen by time. After several minutes, the final screw dropped onto the floor with a small metallic clink. Jack gripped the edge of the panel and pulled. At first it didn't move. Then, with a long, grinding sound, the metal plate shifted slightly. Jack wedged the pry bar into the gap and pushed. The panel slowly peeled away from the refrigerator's body. Dust fell in small clouds as the metal bent outward. For a moment, Jack thought he had been wrong. All he could see was darkness inside the cavity. But then his flashlight beam caught something. Not wires, not machinery. Something wrapped, neatly stacked. Rectangular shapes arranged tightly together like bricks behind the hidden wall. Jack froze. His heart began beating a little faster. He reached inside slowly and pulled the nearest bundle into the light. It was wrapped in old cloth, sealed carefully with hardened wax along the edges. Jack stared at it for a long moment. Something about the careful wrapping sent a quiet chill through him. This wasn't random junk someone had shoved away. This had been placed here deliberately, carefully, protected. Jack took out his pocket knife and cut along the waxed seam. The cloth peeled open slowly, and the moment the contents finally came into view, Jack felt the breath leave his chest, because what sat in his hands was money. Not modern money, but stacks of thick, cream-colored paper bills with ornate designs and faded seals from another era. Money that looked like it had been waiting there. For nearly a century. For a long moment, Jack Morrison simply stood there in the quiet cabin, staring at the stack of old bills in his hands. The afternoon light streamed through the dusty window behind him, illuminating the worn paper in a soft golden glow. The bills felt heavier than they should have, not because of their weight, but because of the time they carried with them. Jack had handled money his whole life. Paychecks folded into envelopes, crumpled bills pulled from pockets after long days of work. But this was different. These bills were thick, almost stiff, their edges still sharp despite their age. The designs printed across them were ornate, far more elaborate than the modern currency he was used to. Deep green ink curled around official seals, and elegant lettering that belonged to another era entirely. Jack turned one of the bills over slowly, and then he saw the words printed across the top. Gold certificate. He felt a small chill move through his chest. Jack wasn't a historian, but he knew enough about old money to understand what that meant. Gold certificates hadn't been used for generations. They came from a time when every bill represented real gold held somewhere in a vault, which meant these weren't just old. They were rare, possibly extremely valuable. Jack looked back toward the open refrigerator cavity. More bundles remained stacked neatly inside, each wrapped in the same yellowed cloth. There were far more than the single bundle he held in his hands. 10, maybe 15, maybe more. He set the open bundle gently on the wooden table and pulled another from the hidden compartment. Same careful wrapping, same wax seal, same stacks of aged currency inside. Jack ran a slow hand over his face. "This can't be real," he whispered. But everything about it felt real. Too real. He glanced around the cabin again. The broken chairs, the cracked fireplace stones, the sagging roof beams. Nothing about this place suggested hidden wealth. If someone had gone to the trouble of hiding money like this, why leave it behind? Jack turned his attention back to the refrigerator. He leaned forward and shined his flashlight deeper into the cavity. Behind the bundles, tucked carefully against the back wall, was something else. A thinner package. Not cloth this time, paper. Jack reached inside and pulled it free. The bundle was tied with a brittle string that snapped easily in his hands. Inside were several folded documents and a small stack of black and white photographs held together by a rusted paperclip. Jack carried them to the table and sat down slowly. The cabin felt quieter now. Not peaceful quiet. The kind of quiet that settles in when a man realizes he has stepped into something far larger than he expected. He picked up the photographs first. The images were old, the kind printed on thick matte paper from nearly a century ago. In one photo, a man stood beside a dark sedan parked along a dirt road. He wore a fedora tilted low over his brow, his expression unreadable beneath the shadow of the brim. Another showed a woman holding a small child, standing near what looked like a farmhouse porch. The third photo made Jack pause. It showed a stretch of countryside rolling hills, a narrow road, and what appeared to be a railway line cutting across the landscape. Jack turned the photograph over. Written on the back, in careful pencil handwriting, was a date, 1932. Jack felt the air leave his lungs. He set the photographs down and unfolded the documents. The pages were thin and fragile, typed with an old mechanical typewriter whose letters pressed unevenly into the paper. Some of the documents referenced deposits. Others mentioned transfers and certificates. The language was formal, precise, and strangely cautious, as if whoever wrote them had been careful not to explain too much in plain words. But one phrase appeared again and again. Ransom funds. Jack leaned back slowly in his chair. Now the pieces were beginning to fit together. In the early 1930s, the country had been gripped by one of the most famous kidnapping cases in American history, a crime that had captured headlines across the nation. The kidnappers had demanded a massive ransom, paid almost entirely in gold certificates. Some of the money had eventually been recovered, but not all of it. A portion of the ransom had simply vanished. Jack stared at the stacks of old currency sitting on the table. His heart began to beat harder. "Don't tell me," he murmured quietly. He reached for the final item inside the paper bundle, a folded sheet thicker than the others. Carefully, he opened it. The paper crackled softly as it unfolded across the table. It wasn't a document. It was a map, hand-drawn, precise. Roads were sketched in dark ink lines. Rivers curved through the landscape. Certain locations were marked not with names, but with simple shapes, circles, triangles, and small crosses. Notes filled the margins. Distances written in careful handwriting. Directions measured not in miles, but in minutes. Jack studied it in silence. Whoever had drawn this map hadn't been guessing. They had been navigating, planning, returning to the same place again and again. And suddenly the refrigerator hiding the money made perfect sense. It wasn't just a hiding place. It was a vault meant to travel. Something that could be moved quietly from one place to another while carrying a secret no one else would think to search for. Jack folded the map slowly. The forest outside had grown darker without him noticing. Evening shadows stretched across the cabin floor. For the first time since arriving, Jack felt something heavy settle in his chest. A realization, because if this money truly belonged to a nearly century-old crime, then someone else might still be looking for it. And now that he had opened that refrigerator, Jack Morrison had unknowingly stepped into a story that had been waiting nearly 100 years to be finished. Jack Morrison didn't move for a long time. The map lay open on the table, the edges curling slightly under the weight of the old photographs. Outside, the forest had grown darker. Evening shadows slipped slowly between the trees, turning the quiet woods into a place that felt deeper and older than it had that morning. A few hours ago, this cabin had been nothing more than a repair project. Now it felt like the center of a story that had begun nearly a century earlier. Jack stood and walked slowly to the window. The pines outside swayed gently in the evening breeze. Somewhere far off, a crow called once and then fell silent again. Everything looked normal. But inside the cabin, nothing felt normal anymore. Jack returned to the table and looked again at the stacks of gold certificates. Even without counting them, he knew there had to be thousands of dollars there. Maybe tens of thousands. In modern terms, that could mean millions. But the money wasn't what unsettled him most. It was the map. Whoever had drawn it hadn't meant for it to sit forgotten in a rusty refrigerator for nearly 100 years. The careful notes, the corrections written in the margins, it all suggested someone had used this map repeatedly. Someone had followed those routes before, which meant the refrigerator might not have been the final hiding place. Just one stop along the way. Jack leaned over the map again. The symbols began to make more sense the longer he studied them. A small triangle near what looked like an old rail line. A circle beside a bend in a river. Short handwritten notes beside several of the markings. Most were faded, but a few could still be read. 30 paces from the stone marker, 2 minutes east after the tracks. Jack rubbed his chin thoughtfully. This wasn't a treasure map. It was a navigation record. Someone had been moving something, maybe money. Maybe documents in this map had helped them return to the same place again and again. Jack exhaled slowly, and suddenly a thought crossed his mind that made the room feel colder. What if something else was still out there? What if the money in the refrigerator was only part of it? Before he could follow that thought any further, a sudden vibration broke the silence. Jack jumped slightly. The sound came from his jacket pocket. His phone? He frowned. Almost no one had his number anymore except a few contractors and the hardware store in town. He pulled the phone out and looked at the screen. Unknown number. A text message. Jack opened it. For a moment, he thought he had read it wrong. The message was only one sentence. "Did you find what you were looking for?" Jack felt his stomach tighten. He stared at the screen, reading the words again. There was no name attached. No explanation. Just the message. Slowly, he lifted his head and looked around the cabin. The door remained closed. The forest outside was dark now, the trees standing like silent shadows beyond the windows. Jack typed a short reply. "Who is this?" The message showed as delivered. Then the screen went quiet. 30 seconds passed. Then another vibration. A second message appeared. "You weren't supposed to open that." Jack's chest tightened. He looked back toward the refrigerator across the room. The open back panel still hung loosely from the metal frame, exposing the hidden cavity where the bundles had been stacked. Someone knew. Not just about the money. About the refrigerator. Jack typed again. "How do you know about this?" This time the response came almost instantly. "Because it doesn't belong to you." Jack's fingers hovered over the keyboard, unsure what to type next. His mind raced through possibilities. Maybe someone from the town. Maybe the previous owner of the cabin. Or maybe something else. Another message arrived before he could answer. "You should leave the cabin tonight." Jack felt the quiet air of the room shift around him. The message continued. "Some things are better left buried." For several seconds, Jack simply stared at the screen. Then he looked back at the map on the table, at the old photographs, at the stacks of money that had been hidden for nearly a century. He thought about the man in the photograph beside the dark sedan, about the ransom documents, about the careful map drawn by someone who had clearly believed this secret was worth protecting for the rest of their life. And suddenly, something inside Jack changed. For years, he had spent his life fixing things others ignored. Old machines, broken houses, forgotten places. Now it seemed fate had handed him something else that had been abandoned and forgotten. A story. One that had been waiting almost 100 years for someone curious enough to finish it. Jack set the phone down on the table. Yes, the screen lit again. One final message appeared. "Don't follow the map." Jack looked at it for a long moment. Then he reached forward and folded the map carefully in half. Because deep down, he already knew something the sender clearly hoped he wouldn't realize. If they were warning him not to follow the map, then that meant the map still led somewhere. And whatever waited at the end of it, someone was very afraid he might find it. Jack Morrison sat alone in the cabin long after darkness had settled over the forest. The phone lay silent on the table beside the folded map, its screen now black again. Outside, the wind moved gently through the tall pines, brushing the branches together with a soft whisper that sounded almost like distant voices. For a long time, Jack didn't touch the map. He simply sat there, elbows resting on the table, staring into the dim room as the small lantern beside him flickered quietly. 10 years ago, he might have walked away from something like this. 10 years ago, when life had still felt predictable. Back when his wife, Laura, was still alive. Laura had always been the curious one between them. The kind of person who believed that every story deserved to be finished. Jack could almost hear her voice now. "If you walk away without knowing, you'll wonder about it for the rest of your life." He smiled faintly at the memory. "Yeah," he muttered softly to the empty cabin. "You probably would have opened the fridge first thing." The forest outside creaked gently as the temperature dropped. Jack finally reached for the map again. He unfolded it slowly, smoothing the worn paper across the wooden table. The hand-drawn lines seemed even more deliberate in the lantern light. Roads curved across the page, some crossed out and corrected. Symbols marked locations that clearly meant something to the person who had drawn them. Jack traced one of the routes with his finger. It led away from the cabin, deeper into the forest, toward the small triangle symbol he had noticed earlier. Beside it was a note written in cramped handwriting. Old rail crossing 3 minutes north. Jack leaned back in his chair. He had driven past an abandoned railway line earlier that afternoon, about 15 minutes from the cabin. At the time, it had just seemed like another relic of the past. Now it felt like something else. A starting point. Jack folded the map again and slid it carefully into his jacket pocket. The decision came quietly, not dramatic. Just a calm certainty settling into place. He stood up and moved through the cabin, gathering a few things from his truck outside. A flashlight, a pair of work gloves, a small shovel he kept in the bed of the truck for clearing debris. He wasn't preparing for danger. At least that's what he told himself. He was just preparing for the forest. By the time Jack finished, the night had grown completely dark. The moon hung low above the trees, casting pale silver light across the narrow dirt road that led away from the cabin. Jack paused beside his truck for a moment. The forest looked different at night. Deeper, older, as if the trees themselves had been watching the land long before any human had drawn maps across it. He climbed into the driver's seat and started the engine. The headlights cut a narrow tunnel of light through the darkness as he slowly drove away from the cabin. For the first few minutes, the road was familiar, the same winding path he had followed earlier that day. But eventually the trees grew thicker, the road narrowed, and the forest seemed to close in around him. Jack drove in silence. His mind replayed the message on his phone. Don't follow the map. Whoever had sent that message clearly knew exactly what the map led to, which meant they were watching closely enough to know what he had already discovered. The thought should have frightened him, but strangely, it didn't, because the warning had revealed something else, something important. If the sender had truly wanted the secret to stay buried, they wouldn't have warned him at all. They would have simply stayed silent. Warnings meant fear, and fear meant the map still mattered. 15 minutes later, Jack slowed the truck as the trees opened slightly along the roadside. The broken silhouette of an old railway embankment appeared ahead, rising like a shadow against the night sky. The tracks themselves had long since been removed, leaving only the gravel ridge where the line had once run. Jack pulled the truck to a stop and shut off the engine. The sudden silence felt enormous. He stepped out, flashlight in hand, and walked toward the embankment. The air smelled of damp soil and fallen leaves. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called softly. Jack climbed the small slope until he reached the top of the old rail bed. From there, he pulled the map from his pocket and turned on the flashlight. The beam illuminated the faded ink lines. He rotated the map slightly, aligning the drawn railway with the one beneath his feet. Then he looked for the triangle symbol. It was there, just a short distance east along the abandoned line. Next to it, the same note again. 3 minutes. Jack slipped the map back into his pocket and started walking along the rail bed. His boots crunched softly on the gravel. Each step felt heavier than the last. Not from exhaustion, from the quiet understanding that he was walking deeper into a story that had been waiting almost a century for someone to continue it. After about 2 minutes, he slowed. The beam of his flashlight moved slowly across the ground. And then he saw it. A shallow depression beside the rail embankment, almost hidden beneath fallen leaves. Jack crouched and brushed away the dirt with his gloved hand. Beneath the soil, the edge of a concrete slab appeared, and in the center of the slab, a rusted iron ring. Jack stared at it quietly. Then he wrapped his fingers around the ring and pulled. The slab shifted slightly, heavy, but movable. Jack swallowed slowly. because whatever waited beneath that concrete lid had likely been buried there long before he was ever born. Jack Morrison tightened his grip on the rusted iron ring. For a moment, he didn't move. The forest around him felt impossibly still, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. His flashlight beam trembled slightly across the cracked concrete slab, illuminating years of dirt and moss that had gathered across its surface. This place had been sealed for a long time, maybe decades, maybe longer. Jack planted his boots firmly against the gravel and pulled again. The slab shifted with a grinding sound, the concrete scraping against stone beneath it. He leaned his weight into the motion, muscles tightening in his arms, until the lid finally tipped sideways and slid off with a dull thud against the ground. The opening beneath it was narrow, just wide enough for a man to climb down. Jack raised the flashlight and aimed the beam into the darkness below. The light cut through several feet of empty space before striking the bottom of the shaft. Concrete walls, old, cracked with age, and sitting on the floor at the bottom, a metal box. Jack felt his pulse quicken. The box was small, maybe 2 feet wide, but it was heavy steel, the kind used for safes decades ago. Its surface was scratched and dented from years underground. A thick padlock hung from the latch. But it was broken, bent open. Jack stared at it for a long moment. Someone had been here before him. He climbed down slowly, bracing his shoulders against the rough walls of the shaft until his boots touched the damp floor below. The air down there smelled of rust and wet earth. He knelt beside the metal box and lifted the lid. It creaked open easily. Too easily, because inside there was nothing, just empty darkness. Jack sat back on his heels, letting out a slow breath. For a moment, disappointment washed over him. All that mystery, all that waiting, and the box was empty. But as the feeling settled, another realization quietly took its place. The empty box didn't mean the map was wrong. It meant the map had been right. Someone had followed it before. Someone had found this place. Jack climbed back out of the shaft and stood beside the open pit, looking across the silent forest. The night felt heavier now, as if the past itself had stepped closer. Then, suddenly, headlights flared through the trees. Jack turned quickly. A car rolled slowly into the clearing near the abandoned railway embankment. The engine idled low as the vehicle came to a stop about 30 feet away. The driver's door opened. A man stepped out. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. The stranger was older, maybe in his late 50s or early 60s, dressed in plain clothes that revealed nothing about who he might be. But there was something calm about the way he stood there. Something practiced. "You found it," the man said quietly. Jack didn't answer right away. He studied the stranger carefully. "You're the one who sent the messages," Jack said. The man gave a faint nod. "Yes." His eyes drifted toward the open shaft in the ground. "Looks like you were just a little too late." Jack crossed his arms. "So the box was yours?" The man shook his head slowly. "No," he said. "It belonged to my grandfather." Jack felt the pieces shift in his mind. "The accomplice," he said. The man nodded again. "The one who took part of the ransom before the others were caught." He glanced toward the forest. "My family has spent almost 100 years protecting that secret." Jack studied him carefully. "And the money in the refrigerator?" "A mistake," the man said quietly. "Something my grandfather hid as insurance. A backup in case everything else went wrong." Jack looked down at the open pit again. "And the rest of it?" The man gave a small shrug. "Gone. Spent long before I was born." The wind moved gently through the trees again. For a moment, the forest returned to its quiet. Jack looked back at the man. "Then why come here tonight?" The stranger smiled faintly. to see the man who finally finished the story. Jack frowned slightly. What story? The man nodded toward the open shaft. My grandfather believed secrets could live forever if they were buried deep enough. He paused. But secrets don't disappear. They wait. His gaze shifted back to Jack. And sometimes, they wait for the right person to uncover them. The words lingered between them. For the first time since this strange journey had begun, Jack felt something unexpected. Not fear, not tension. Closure. The stranger stepped back toward his car. You did something my family never had the courage to do, he said. You brought the past back into the open. He opened the car door. Maybe now it can finally rest. The engine started again. The headlights turned slowly across the clearing as the car pulled away, disappearing down the dark forest road. Jack stood alone beside the open pit for a long time after that. The forest returned to its natural silence, and somewhere in that quiet, Jack realized something important. The discovery had never really been about the money. It had been about truth, about unfinished stories, and about the strange way the past sometimes finds its way back into the world, through the most ordinary people. Jack turned off his flashlight and looked up at the moon hanging above the trees. Then, slowly, he walked back toward his truck, because sometimes the most extraordinary journeys don't begin with adventure. They begin with a man buying an old forgotten place, and deciding he's not afraid to open what others were too afraid to touch. When Jack Morrison returned to the cabin that night, the forest felt different. Not quieter, not darker. Just settled. The refrigerator still stood in the corner of the small kitchen. The hidden compartment now empty. Its secret finally uncovered after nearly a century. The map rested folded on the table, beside the old photographs and the stack of fragile documents that had carried a forgotten story across generations. Jack sat down slowly and looked around the little cabin. For most of his life, he had believed that ordinary people lived ordinary lives. Fix the broken things, pay the bills, keep moving forward. But that night reminded him of something he had almost forgotten. Every life eventually crosses paths with a story bigger than itself. Most people walk past those moments without noticing. Others notice, but turn away. And then there are the rare few who decide to keep going, even when the path ahead is uncertain. Jack hadn't gone looking for history. He had simply followed his curiosity. But sometimes curiosity is exactly what the world needs. Because buried beneath the quiet surface of ordinary life, there are truths waiting for someone brave enough to uncover them. If this story moved you or made you think differently about the quiet mysteries hidden in everyday life, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next story.